Picture yourself handed command of an army that has just suffered one of the worst defeats in your nation's history. Your men are starving. Most have no shoes. Half the ranks have vanished through desertion. The enemy holds nearly every major city and fort across an entire region, and your government has almost nothing left to send you. Now imagine spending the next 2 years fighting battle after battle and losing every single one. Yet when the smoke finally clears and the treaties are signed, you are the man credited with winning the war. That is the story of Nathanael Greene and the campaign he waged across the American South between 1780 and 1782 stands as one of the most brilliant in military history, even though he never won a single major engagement. He is the general who discovered that battles and wars are not the same thing. How does a Quaker blacksmith's son from a tiny Rhode Island village end up leading the entire southern wing of the Continental Army? It starts in Potawatomi, a small coastal settlement where the Greene family ran a forge and anchor works. Born there in 1742, the son of a prosperous Quaker merchant and preacher, Nathanael grew up surrounded by contradiction. Quakers were pacifists who wanted nothing to do with the study of war, yet the boy could not leave it alone. He traded for forbidden books and smuggled in texts on tactics and fortification, reading them by candlelight, while his father assumed he had his nose in scripture. He studied Caesar and Frederick the Great, worked through the military volumes favored by the Boston bookseller Henry Knox, and absorbed the writings of European strategists like Turenne and Saxe. He even taught himself geometry, recognizing it as essential to understanding fortifications and artillery placement. By the time shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, Greene had absorbed more military theory than most serving British officers, despite never having commanded a soldier, heard a cannon fired, or set foot on a battlefield. He also carried something that might have ended most military careers before they began: a pronounced limp. Possibly from a stiff knee at birth, possibly from an old accident at the forge. At a time when officers were expected to look commanding on horseback, Greene didn't fit the mold. A limping, self-taught bookworm whose own Quaker meeting eventually expelled him for the crime of attending a militia parade. Yet that blend of relentless study and outsider thinking would turn him into one of the most effective generals America ever fielded. When war finally broke out in 1775, Greene helped organize a Rhode Island militia unit called the Kentish Guards, and enlisted as a private, not an officer. Within months, the colony's assembly jumped him straight to brigadier general, handing him command of roughly 1,500 men bound for the siege of Boston. There he caught the attention of George Washington, who noticed that Greene's camp was among the cleanest and best disciplined in the entire ragtag Continental Army. The two men built what became the single most important command relationship of the Revolution, with Washington trusting Greene's judgment above any other officers, and turning to him whenever the hardest jobs needed doing. That trust was tested almost immediately. Greene led one of the 2 assault columns across the ice-choked Delaware to help win at Trenton on Christmas night 1776, then fought again at Princeton, Brandywine, and Germantown. He also took a costly lesson when his advice to hold Fort Washington in New York led to a crushing defeat, but rather than make excuses, he studied what had gone wrong and adjusted. Then in the brutal winter of 1778, with soldiers starving, freezing, and wrapping bloody feet in rags at Valley Forge, Washington asked him to take over as quartermaster general, the least glamorous post in the army, responsible for feeding, clothing, and moving every man in it. Greene didn't want the job, he wanted to fight. But he understood that an army without food, shoes, or wagons was nothing but a mob waiting to scatter, and he rebuilt the entire supply network from nothing, helping the army limp through its darkest winter. By 1780, the Southern War had collapsed into catastrophe. Charleston had fallen, and General Horatio Gates had then led an entire army to ruin at Camden. Washington's answer was to send Greene south. Reaching the remnants of the Southern Army in Charlotte that December, Greene found roughly 1,400 starving, barely clothed men, no functioning supply system, and a countryside torn apart by vicious partisan fighting between Loyalist and Patriot militias. Rather than gamble everything on one battle the way Gates had, Greene did something military orthodoxy called suicidal. He split his already tiny force, sending Daniel Morgan west with 600 men, while he moved the rest east. It forced Cornwallis to divide his own army to cover both threats, leaving him strong enough to crush neither. Cornwallis sent his feared cavalry commander Benastry Tarleton after Morgan, and at the Cowpens in January 1781, Morgan baited the British into disaster, placing unreliable militia up front to fire twice and flee, then letting the pursuing redcoats run straight into disciplined Continental lines, with cavalry slamming into their flanks. Roughly 800 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in under an hour. Furious, Cornwallis burned his own supply wagons to move faster, and chased Greene's army nearly 200 miles across the Carolinas through freezing winter rain, only to reach the Dan River and watch the Americans slip across into Virginia just hours ahead of him. Most generals would have stopped to rest. Greene turned around and marched straight back into North Carolina, gathering reinforcements to roughly 4,400 men along the way. At Guilford Courthouse that March, Cornwallis attacked and technically won the field, but it cost him over 500 irreplaceable regulars, more than a quarter of his army, in brutal fighting that at one point saw his own artillery firing grapeshot into a melee that included his own troops. A British statesman reportedly remarked that another such victory would ruin the British Army, and he was right. Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas entirely and marched for the Virginia coast, a retreat that would eventually trap him at a small port called Yorktown. Greene stayed behind to finish the job, working with partisan leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens to dismantle the web of British outposts still holding the interior while their guerrilla raids cut supply lines elsewhere. He lost again at Hobkirk's Hill, failed to capture the fortified post at 96 after weeks of siege, and was driven from the field at Eutaw Springs that September. Yet every single time, Greene withdrew with his core army intact, while the British bled soldiers, supplies, and territory they could never replace. He was trading ground for time, swapping battles for slow attrition, never trying to destroy the British in one decisive clash, but to bleed them dry one costly victory at a time. After Eutaw Springs, the British retreated to Charleston and never came out again, leaving the Carolina interior essentially liberated without a single decisive American win. Cornwallis's flight toward Yorktown and his surrender there in October 1781 was only possible because Greene had shut every other door in the South. Greene paid dearly for that campaign, having pledged his own fortune and personal credit to keep his starving army fed when Congress sent nothing but excuses. He died deep in debt in 1786 at Mulberry Grove, a Georgia plantation granted to him after the war, probably of heatstroke, at just 43 years old. His widow Catherine spent years untangling his finances. In a strange historical footnote, that same plantation later hosted a young Yale graduate named Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin there as her houseguest. Nathanael Greene never won a major battle, never held high office, and is barely remembered today. But the men who served beside him knew the truth, and military historians still study his Southern campaign as one of history's finest examples of strategic attrition. He proved that wars aren't won by whoever holds the most battlefields at sunset. They're won by whoever understands what the fighting is truly for and refuses to lose the one thing that matters most, the army itself.